It's an all-singing, all-dancing, all-Konami episode of Metroidvania Works.
I'll buy that for $1.
One of the less heralded moments in the evolution of the Metroidvania genre comes to us from Konami, with an original MSX release that shipped a few weeks after the Goonies 2 in Japan, and a Famicom version that came a few months after that. As with Konami's Goonies sequel, Majo Densetsu 2, Gallius no Meikyu, or Knightmare II: The Maze of Gallius, represents a marked improvement and increase in complexity over the game that preceded it. The original Knightmare had been a simple vertical auto-scrolling shooter, which stood out at the time for its unusual use of Western fantasy stylings over something like the science fiction themes more common to vertical shoot-'em-ups. Starring a small knight marching ever upward through scrolling fields of monsters, Knightmare played pretty much like a standard scrolling shooter, but its aesthetics caused it to fall somewhere between contemporaries like Namco's Dragon Spirit and Taito's Kiki Kaikai. Knightmare II, on the other hand, is a more involved creation that reflects the hottest trend in Japanese game design for 1987, RPG elements. Rather than playing as an auto-scrolling top-down shooter, Knightmare II on MSX lacks scrolling and unfolds through a side-on platform action game with ample exploration and a bit of inventory management. While largely unknown outside Japan, Knightmare II emerged as a reasonably popular cult title in its home territory. If it seems in any way familiar to most modern game enthusiasts, that's because it heavily influenced the design of Nigoro's La Mulana series, particularly the original freeware version. When Konami adapted Knightmare from MSX to NES, they upgraded the tech accordingly, adding more detailed and colorful visuals, as well as side-scrolling. This makes Knightmare II an interesting case study, a transitional point between older, single-screen proto-Metroidvania titles like Montezuma's Revenge, and more contemporary takes on the format such as, well, Metroid and Castlevania II. Knightmare II introduces another interesting first for this style of game. While protagonist Popolone only has one life measured by a single life bar, he's not the only hero of the story. You can switch out freely between characters, swapping in heroine Aphrodite, who looks exactly like Popolone except wearing pink armor rather than blue, and she'll take up his quest as well. Konami would make frequent use of character switching mechanics throughout the 8-bit era, as seen in imports like Konami YY World, and of course, major licensed titles like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Tiny Toon Adventures. This early prototypical approach isn't quite as fully realized as those subsequent works. The differences between Popolone and Aphrodite are less about obvious unique combat skills as in Nintendo's Doki Doki Panic, which would debut a few months later, and more about nuanced factors to do with utility. Aphrodite is better at maneuvering through water, gets better prices on goods in certain shops, and handles some secondary weapons a bit more effectively than her husband. A significant part of sorting out their unique abilities involves trying different approaches on the fly as you play, which is the general rule of this game. Knightmare II demands players explore and experiment, failing and trying repeatedly until they get things right. It's not a punishing game exactly, more like obstinate. The eponymous Maze of Gallius is filled with monsters, but also with locked doors, hidden passages, and seemingly inaccessible areas. Fortunately, Popolone and Aphrodite can make use of a variety of weapons that help them battle enemies, while also doubling as tools to forge new paths, as our Lord and Savior Yoshio Sakamoto intended. For example, you can acquire magical devices that basically function as landmines, which are as effective at detonating monsters, too low for Popolone or Aphrodite to hit with their swords as they are at blasting open new passages in the floor. Much as with Metroid, most of the hidden passages and destructible blocks you need to uncover in order to advance aren't marked or obvious, so there's a lot of trial and error to be done. A fact that makes Knightmare II a little difficult to revisit in the here and now, the same as many Metroidvanias of this primal era. And really, aside from allowing you to switch between two slightly different characters, Knightmare II doesn't break a lot of new ground. Even the seeming RPG elements, namely the experience meter beneath each character's health bar, feel superficial at best. Maxing out your EXP bar doesn't make your heroes more powerful or durable, it just refills your health meter. Still, Konami managed to capture the essential intrigue of dropping players into a massive and letting them sort things out. This is a slower and less inscrutable variant of Legacy of the Wizard, basically, and you can understand how it would have made a big impression on players back in 1987. Also from Konami, and for MSX, a much better known and more influential tangent to the Metroidvania genre comes in the form of Metal Gear. At this point in history, July 1987, the Metroidvania is definitely an established thing, even if it doesn't have a name yet. And that thing involves side-scrolling. Metal Gear, therefore, is not a proper Metroidvania. It's more of an evolution of the concepts seen in The Legend of Zelda, and it's the thematic inverse of the original Knightmare, an action RPG that leaves behind the genre's usual fantasy tropes in favor of sci-fi tinged military elements. In terms of themes, Metal Gear seems like the premise that would have made for a more intuitive auto-scrolling vertical shooter, while Knightmare's story would have seemed a more natural fit for a top-down action RPG. And yet, here we are. Blame it on the MSX platform. If not for the computer's limitations, Metal Gear might well have turned out to be nothing more than a simple shooter in the vein of Capcom's Commando. But due to the MSX and even the MSX2's specs' underwhelming support for scrolling visuals and simultaneous on-screen sprites, designer Hideo Kojima decided it would be futile to attempt to coax a satisfying, pure action game out of his project, and opted instead for something slower and more complex. Metal Gear is unusual in that it's a military combat game in which direct shootouts and conflicts rarely represent the ideal approach to play. The protagonist, codenamed Solid Snake, can amass quite an arsenal for himself, but once the bullets start flying, it's difficult to avoid being overwhelmed by enemy forces. Instead, Metal Gear emphasizes stealth, encouraging players to stay out of the enemy's view and use their lethal weapons sparingly in order to avoid alerting soldiers with the noise of a gun report or mine detonation. This was not some totally original game design concept, of course. Muse Software pioneered the concept of military stealth way back in 1981 with Castle Wolfenstein for Apple II. And Firebird Software had enjoyed moderate success in 1986 with a BBC Micro stealth puzzle game called The Sentinel. Around the same time, Pac-In Video had adapted Sylvester Stallone's Rambo First Blood Part 2 into a pair of MSX action games in which the title character had to sneak around the jungle gathering weapons and tools while avoiding detection by staying out of his foe's line of sight. Given that Kojima has proven to be a massive nerd for Western pop culture, it's hard to imagine that he would have been completely unaware of a major Western computer hit like Castle Wolfenstein, or that he would somehow have been oblivious to a game adaptation of one of America's biggest box office hits for 1985 appearing on the same platform that he developed for. But whatever inspiration Metal Gear took from that prior work, this is no trite, derivative clone. Metal Gear is a fully realized work that pushes the action RPG in new directions. Arguably, the biggest innovation in Metal Gear is the addition of a built-in narrative device, Snake's transceiver. Set to its own dedicated keyboard button, activating the transceiver takes you to a separate screen where you can send and receive calls to and from a list of radio contacts. As with The Legend of Zelda and Rambo for MSX, Metal Gear's environment, a multi-building fortress complex called Outer Heaven, is divided up into standalone screens. Just about every screen of the game has some sort of unique transceiver message for you, depending on which contact you call, and a good many of these messages relay useful information. Mission-critical information is denoted by the call indicator, which announces a broadcast from your mission commander, who will relay a new mission objective or other essential advice for surviving your journey through enemy territory. Metal Gear's premise, a one-man infiltration of Outer Heaven, lends itself to both stealth and remote guidance. You receive just enough dialogue here via transceiver and the occasional in-person encounter to define the bare minimum of a functional plot, while also giving players a more focused experience than the aimless, poke-around-everywhere approach of Knightmare II. There's not much to Metal Gear's story, and Solid Snake himself isn't a proper character even by the loosest definition of the word, but the transceiver's steady drip feed of information gives context to the environments and helps justify your scattered mission objectives. By and large, Metal Gear observes a classic lock and key structure. The passages of Outer Heaven are closed off by 8 electronic lock types, each of which can only be opened with a corresponding card key. Acquiring new card keys grants Snake access to deeper portions of the fortress, and many of those keys are hidden behind critical story objectives like boss encounters. However, many of Snake's weapons and tools also double as keys. Plastic explosives can destroy specific types of equipment, including the eponymous nuclear battle tank, but plastique can also destroy weak walls. The rocket launcher lets you take out threats from a safe distance, but it can also destroy control panels for otherwise impassable stretches of floor. An enemy uniform lets you pass unchallenged into the more secure areas of the fortress, while a compass is the only tool that will allow you to navigate the sprawling wasteland between buildings. You need a gas mask to bypass rooms filled with toxins, a parachute to safely leap from the highest floors of the fortress to the ground below, and a metal detector to avoid dying in the minefield zone. All of these tools and devices can be found within Outer Heaven, and much of your game time is spent hunting for essential mechanisms in order to advance. This involves taking a lot of side excursions into out-of-the-way locations like sub-basements or backtracking to previously explored areas. In the early going, your mission commander, codenamed Big Boss, guides you directly to the tools you need. The further you advance, however, the less reliable he becomes. What initially appear to be innocuous slip-ups, like forgetting to alert you to a room flooded with poisonous gas, become more and more frequent, especially once Big Boss changes his contact frequency. Of course, it turns out Big Boss, or is that Venom Snake, is secretly the enemy leader, playing two sides against the other and therefore highly invested in making certain the player's mission ends in failure. The twists and turns of this running transceiver commentary do a great job of easing players into the rhythms and expectations of Metal Gear before leaving them more or less to their own devices beyond the game's midway point. It makes for an adventure that expects a certain amount of resourcefulness and sharp thinking, yet it doesn't leave you completely adrift. Perhaps the most significant move away from the typical mid-80s gaming mindset of throwing players into the deep end from the start and expecting them to sink or swim. Certainly Castlevania II, Zelda II, and the Goonies II presented players with a fair amount of text, but Metal Gear gives you the ability to receive and even solicit information no matter where you are. And unlike Castlevania II with its love for misdirecting players with false information from mean-spirited villagers, Metal Gear makes its swerve into deception pretty obvious. Even in terse 8-bit transcripts, Big Boss really hams it up when he does his heel turn. Metal Gear also takes an interesting approach in terms of its treatment of Outer Heaven as a virtual place. While the entire fortress consists of individual self-contained screen-sized spaces, these areas actually blur together at times. In terms of its puzzle-like stealth design, each screen is pretty good about giving you an entry point that places you out of the enemy's line of sight. Patrolling soldiers usually appear in different starting positions, depending on where you step into the screen, meaning you rarely run the risk of being spotted the instant you enter a new area. And that's not always true in the latter portions of the game, but Metal Gear gives you the means to avoid being spotted in the form of a pair of binoculars that let you look ahead one screen to see where the enemies will be located. Generally speaking, Outer Heaven patrols reset when you step out of a screen and return, turning the process of advancing and backtracking through the game into a matter of observing patterns and avoiding contact. If you're spotted, however, waves of soldiers will come at you, and just keep coming, even if you manage to gun them down. Try to shake them off by ducking to the next screen, and the alert will carry over with you. Duck into an interior room, and the bad guys will flood in after you, guns ablaze. Metal Gear places a heavy burden on players to avoid enemy interaction, and while the penalty for mistakes isn't necessarily a game over, as it's possible to shoot your way through an alert or reset the enemy patrols by moving to a different floor or building, it can be tough to recover from the damage you take from mixing it up with the enemy. As with games like The Legend of Zelda, Solid Snake does have a few opportunities to grow in strength and durability as his quest progresses. Defeating enemy bosses causes your military rank to increase a step, which expands both the size of your life bar and the maximum amount of different ammunition types you can carry. You can lose rank by accidentally killing prisoners of war, and one particularly nasty boss hides behind hostages to make it difficult to defeat him without suffering a huge and permanent penalty to your character growth. But there is no experience system here, nor is there any economy. Enemies don't drop any sort of loot, in fact, meaning there's very little incentive to kill the soldiers you encounter. Even on screens where there's no way to avoid an instant alert state, you're better off just running and avoiding damage rather than standing your ground and wasting health or restorative items. It's an unusual and interesting take on the exploratory action game, one driven by story and defined by the need to avoid conflict as much as possible. Although Metal Gear on MSX would not have a huge direct impact on gaming, the NES conversion, which we'll look at in the next episode of NES Works, would be a sizable hit and would give the Metal Gear name enough legs to return a decade later and revolutionize the medium. Here in 1987, however, Metal Gear is ultimately just an interesting little interpretation of the action RPG model, embracing a blend of influences in order to create a military shooter that fit within the boundaries of its host platform. It's a significant offshoot to the Metroidvania genre, but one that also showcases the growing divide between Metroidvanias and core action RPGs. Next time on Metroidvania Works, Zelda II begins to reveal its influence with a pair of unabashed clones of Nintendo's big hit.